Want to wish everybody a happy Mother's Day again. We're going to continue the series that Nathan started last week in looking at some biblical examples of good mothers. And so today we're going to turn to the book of Ruth, chapter 1. Our main reading today is verses 16 and 17. It says, "But Ruth replied, 'Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me ever so severely, if even death separates me from you.'" That's a powerful statement. You don't just randomly say that to somebody unless they've had a major impact on your life. And so that's kind of what I'd like to look at this morning, is this story. You know, the internet is filled with advice on how to be a good mother. As I was starting to research this a little bit, I looked it up, and there are dozens and dozens of lists of the things you need to do in order to be a good mother. I don't know how anyone can live up to that. And it's not nearly so bad for men. In fact, according to social media, really all men need to do is show up. And they're a good father, right? As long as you don't run off, you're doing pretty good. But not so for women. They have to really live up to a lot of expectations. A child walks up to his dad and says, "Dad, what is a man?" And the dad thinks about this for a while and he says, "Well, son, a man is someone who loves you unconditionally, cares about you, provides for you, and protects you." And the kid thinks about this for a while and he says, "Well, in that case, I want to grow up and be a dad just like Mom." And he was right. Moms live up to what it means to be a dad a lot of times more than dads themselves, right? Well, here's one of the lists that I looked up. So if you want to be a good mom, see if you can live up to all these standards. You need to be accepting, adaptable, attentive, authentic, brave, good communicator, complimentary, consistent, creative, decisive, empathetic, generous, grateful, intuitive, loving, open-minded, patient, reliable, resilient, resourceful, self-accountable, self-aware, trustworthy, and vulnerable. That's a lot. And that's just one of the hundreds of lists. Now, I would have added another characteristic onto this list. I would have added God-fearing. In fact, if you are God-fearing, all of those other categories come with the package. If you love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul, all of those characteristics that we just read kind of naturally develop. And that's why when we were talking about good examples in the Bible of moms, I wanted to talk about Naomi. Naomi, I believe, was a God-fearing mother. And she is an unlikely example of being a great mother. Unlikely because with all of the tragedy and all of the bad things that happened to Naomi, you would have thought that she would have been a forgotten figure in the history of Israel. But that's not what happened. Naomi was the wife of Elimelech, and they lived in Bethlehem, and they had 2 sons. They lived during a time of famine. So there wasn't enough rain, the crops weren't growing, the animals were dying, there wasn't enough food, people were beginning to starve to death. And so to try to take care of his family, Elimelech hears that there isn't a famine in Moab. And so he decides to take his family and go to Moab. Now that's not as easy as it sounds. Traveling back in those days, you couldn't just hop in the car and 12 hours later you'd be in Florida, right? You had to walk where you were going, and you had to carry everything that you had with you and that you were going to need along the way. So this would have been a very arduous and difficult journey. And I'm sure Naomi was not thrilled about taking her family on this long, hard trip. But trusting in her husband, she decides to go with them. The family arrives in Moab, and then tragedy strikes because Elimelech dies. We don't know how he dies, but Naomi is left in a foreign land with 2 sons all by herself. They are strangers in this land. They are aliens, right? Their people are now far away from them. But she continues to raise her 2 sons and endure during this difficult time. And I believe that endurance is a good mark of a good mother. And the reason I do is because that is what happened with my family. The year was 1975, and my dad was having breathing problems, and he kept having pains in his shoulder. And he would go into the doctor, and they didn't know what was going on with him, so they diagnosed him with walking pneumonia. Looking back on that now, we understand that he probably had congestive heart failure. But they didn't know that at the time, and so they diagnosed him with this other disease. He went on a business trip and died of a massive heart attack. And that was devastating to our family. I was 12 years old. My brother and sister were a couple years older than me, but my mom, who was once part of a family, is now left on her own to raise 3 teenagers. And we were right in those difficult ages. But she continued to be a good mother, to take care of us, to provide for us. Before this, she's a stay-at-home mom. Now she has to go out and get a job. And while we knew it was hard for her, we never saw it on her face. What we saw was a good mother who took care of us, and we were never without a mother's love. And so that is why I've always felt my mother is such a great mother. And it's why I believe that Naomi was a good mother. She endured during very difficult times. And she raises these boys. They stay in Moab for about 10 years. The boys grow up. Eventually they meet girls there. They get married, and now they have wives that they bring home to Naomi. And eventually the happiness is shattered again when both of these boys die. And I looked up the circumstances surrounding their deaths and also the death of their father, and there really isn't any definitive reason why or what caused their death. There's a lot of people who speculate what happened, but no certain answers. A lot of people think this book, the book of Ruth, is a story of how God punishes Elimelech and Naomi for leaving Israel and going to Moab. And it is true that God did not want the Israelites to go into these foreign countries, because when you move into a foreign country, you kind of adapt their way of thinking and their way of living, and you kind of accept their gods and their way of life. And he didn't want that for the Israelites, and so he told them not to do that. And that's true, but I don't think that that's what this book is about. I don't think we know how these men died, because the story is not about them. This is a story about the women. So now Naomi is left with these two widows of her sons, and she continues to be a good mother. And how do we know this? How do we know that she was still a God-fearing woman? Well, Naomi leaves a mark on the lives of these two women. You see, at this point, Naomi makes a decision, an important decision, to leave Moab and go back to her home, to go back to her own people, to go back to her own God. And so she's planning to leave, and both of these girls decide, we want to come with you. Well, they wouldn't do that if she wasn't a good role model. And she says, no, you should stay here, because among your own people, you're much more likely to find happiness again. You're much more likely to find another husband and move on with your lives and be happy. So you stay here. Let me go back to my people. And they say, no, we want to come with you. And eventually she does convince Obed, Ruth's sister, to stay and to go back to her people. But Ruth, if you remember, tells her, no, I don't want to go back to my own people. And remember, we read this. It says, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. Ruth has committed her life to Naomi. And not just to Naomi, but to the God of Israel. And that tells me Ruth is a woman of character. Her character has left an everlasting mark on the life of Ruth. In Proverbs 31, 28 to 31, it talks about a woman of character. It says, her children arise and call her blessed. It says, charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Honor her for all that her hands have done, and let her work bring her praise at the city gate. Ruth has experienced God through seeing what a real godly woman is. Naomi's life was her testimony, and that's why she's a great biblical example of motherhood. Ruth and Naomi now return to Bethlehem, and Naomi encourages her to find another husband. And Naomi's relative Boaz meets Ruth. He falls in love with her, and they get married, and eventually they have a son. And that son becomes a redeemer for Naomi. In chapter 4, starting in verse 14, it says, then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer. And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi, and they named him Obed. And he is the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of David. This child, whose mother was a Moabite, is the grandfather of King David himself. Despite all the suffering, despite all of the trials and the tragedies, God has truly blessed Naomi and Ruth. You know what? If you're a mom who's enduring, who's suffering in this life, if you're struggling under the weight of hard times and tragedy, would you remember the life of Naomi and be encouraged by her example? Trust in God. Never give up on your faith, because our God is faithful. He's with us in troubled times, and He will bless you again. Happy Mother's Day.